welcome to the Art of Being Human. I'm going to start a segment today about the psychology of diabetes. What happens to you when you have been diagnosed with diabetes? What happens to your personality? How do you feel? How do you handle how you feel? And I've decided to make this is either the next to the last or the last session that we'll be doing on diabetes, because once I get through this segment on personality and personality change, we will have gone through all of the information I want to go through on diabetes, and then we'll be starting something else. But this has been a very interesting study for me, because I've been diagnosed as diabetic for almost 30 years ago. So for almost 30 years, 28, 29 years around there, I've been diabetic. And I'm not a doctor, but I've walked through what it's like to be diabetic, and I know what it's like, and I've been through quite a few things. And so it gives me a chance to share my personal story. Not that I want to focus on that, but if you are diabetic, or you think you're diabetic, or you've recently been diagnosed, there's a lot you can learn from others who have already gone through this walk, and you can be helped by it. So I've been diagnosed quite a while. Now, I have had a really good life. The diagnosis is a difficult diagnosis, but I've had a pretty good life, and I've done almost everything that I've wanted to do. But it comes with a cost, because you really always have to be taking care of yourself. There's always the next blood test. There's always the next shot. There's always the next medication. There's always checking your blood sugar before you eat. There's always the insulin shots, if you're on insulin, before or after you eat. There's always the medical tests. The kidneys have to be checked. The eyes have to be checked. The heart has to be checked. It's a continual runaround of different tests and different medications and insulin shots. And how can you travel with the insulin? And can you go overseas with the insulin? And how do you take care of the insulin? You know, can you bring your syringes overseas? There's always something to contend with if you're diabetic. But that doesn't mean you can't have a good life. If you have a good life, you take care of yourself. That's one of the things that comes at a cost. You can have a good life with diabetes. You can get bad complications. Some people don't even know they're diabetic until they get the complications, because they don't have symptoms severe enough to give them a clue that something's really wrong. So it's just a very interesting study. And I started studying about diabetes when I was first diagnosed, because I wanted to get a handle on it. I wanted to know what I was going to be dealing with. When you first become diagnosed with diabetes, you really feel guilty about it, you feel upset about it, and you feel like something's definitely wrong, and it might be your fault, and you don't know how you're going to handle it, and what you're trying to do is stay away from complications. You're afraid you're going to get complications, you're afraid you're going to go blind, you're afraid you're going to have your foot amputated. All of these things can happen, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they will happen. If you take care of yourself, and if you do what is right, and if you go to all the doctor's appointments, and if you take all the medication, and if you go through all the tests, and I have to agree, it's a pain in the you-know-where, but you have to do it, because if you don't, then you will develop complications, and your life won't be as good. So let me give you some advice in terms of being a diabetic. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty. Don't feel guilty that you have a chronic illness, any chronic illness. Don't feel guilty about it. Don't think that you've done anything wrong, because you haven't. Some people will make an issue of it. Some people will say, well, you know, if you hadn't eaten so many sweets, or if you weren't so heavy set, if you didn't weigh so much and all of that, you wouldn't be diabetic. And that's a lot of crock. I hear it all the time, and it drives me crazy. People who are saying, well, if you weren't so heavy, you wouldn't have the symptoms of diabetes. As far as I'm concerned, if you've got it, you've got it. And it's in your genes, or something happened to your pancreas, and it has nothing to do with your diet. Now, after you've been diagnosed, you have to be on a diet, you have to eat right, right and all of this. But at the same time, being heavy or eating sweets or liking carbohydrates or having a lot of pasta, whatever they put on you, whatever people put on you for guilt, doesn't cause you to be diabetic to begin with. Because if you had a healthy pancreas, your pancreas would take care of all of that. People can eat as much sugar and candy as they want. If they've got a healthy pancreas, the pancreas will take care of it. If they don't, then it's going to show up. And once they're diagnosed, they don't have free range to eat everything they want to eat, although some people do anyway, and they get themselves in trouble with that. You have to have constant care if you're a diabetic in order to be able to live and have a good life and to be able to accomplish what your goals are. So let me go on with this. You did not cause it. If you ate a lot of sweets, so what? Most of the cause, going on into what causes diabetes, there are various theories about it, of course, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm speaking from my own experience, I'm speaking from my own research, and so you're free to agree or disagree, but I think that most diabetics are diabetic because it's in their genes. It's a genetic illness. How do they have it? Well, I mean, it's not the only cause, but I think it's the main cause. Most people who are diabetic are type 2, and most diabetics who are type 2 have a history of diabetes somewhere in their family. And it is true that if your father and mother, even one, either your father or mother or both have diabetes, there's a 50% chance that you're going to have it too at some point. Now, it may not show up until you're in your midlife, or you may not get it at all. But generally speaking, if you have a family history of diabetes, which would normally be type 2, then you're going to probably have type 2. I know my sister was just diagnosed with it, or maybe a month or so ago, and she's as old as I am. We're twins. I was diagnosed with it in midlife, and she wasn't diagnosed with it until entering her elderly years, but nonetheless, she is diabetic. But our father was diabetic, and my great-grandmother died of complications of diabetes, and my great-grandmother also had to have a leg amputated because of the complications of diabetes, because the circulation changes, and if you don't get circulation in your legs or in your arms or wherever, then they'll turn black and you have to have amputations, and it gets to be really a very bad situation. But I think for the most part, type 2s will have some kind of a genetic cause for diabetes. Now, that's not always true for type 1. In type 1, a lot of people are type 1 and they have absolutely no history of any kind of diabetes in their family. It just strikes them down, and there they are, and they have it, and they have type 1, and it's very serious, and they could die, and they're on insulin immediately, and a lot of people get it if they're type 1 when they're very young, so that's what's called type 1 juvenile, although we usually don't use those terms anymore, but it's type 1 juvenile. So, but type 2 has a genetic history. A lot of type 1s do not have a genetic history. They get it, they don't know where it came from, they don't have family members with it, they don't understand why they've got it, but there they've got it. But there are other causes of diabetes as well. If you have a flu or some kind of a virus, and the virus settles in your pancreas, it can destroy the beta cells that produce the insulin. And anything that is around the pancreas and that can destroy the pancreas, you may end up by being a type 1 diabetic with no family history at all. And in this case, your diabetes was not caused by a genetic factor, as most type 2s are, but yours was caused by an illness like a virus or bacterial infection that settled around in the pancreatic area or settled in the pancreas and destroyed it. or destroy parts of it. Now you got to remember that insulin is not the only thing that the pancreas does. It does it, but it does produce insulin so that you can manage your blood sugar. But there's also digestive juices that come from it that aid in digestion, that go into the bowel area, that go into the stomach area. So there's a lot more that the pancreas does than just produce the insulin to manage the blood sugar. So that's another reason for becoming diabetic, a flu or a virus. Now, sometimes the body does not use insulin appropriately, and that's called insulin resistance. It can be because the quality of the insulin is not good, and therefore the body can't use it, the cells can't use it, or it can be because something else is wrong and the insulin and the cells are resisting the insulin. There's no uptake. It's not getting into the cells. If it's getting into the cells, it's not being used efficiently. So we can say that some people are diabetic and they have generally enough insulin in their system not to be diabetic. They can have plenty of insulin, but for some reason the cells cannot use it because the cells themselves can't manage it, or because the insulin itself may not be of the best quality, and so therefore the cells don't use it. But the problem with insulin resistance is that it gets worse and worse and worse with time. So a person can have a lot of insulin and end up by having to take insulin shots to overcome the resistance that the cells have. So that's another cause of diabetes. Now, medications can also cause diabetes, and especially medications that have to do with arthritis. There are medications that prevent you from having resistance to a transplant. The medications you have to take so your body does not resist a transplant, that can cause diabetes. And there are medications that patients with AIDS take. Those can cause diabetes. And so there are various medications. And so there are some medications that are used for people who are psychotic. The antipsychotic drugs that are used for people who have mental illnesses. These illnesses require that these people take their medications. If they don't take their medications, they are not normal people. The medications keep the blood chemistry in balance so that they can live a normal life. But some of those medications do cause diabetes. And if that happens, they can't get off the medication because the mental illness will return. So what they have to do is, if diabetes appears as a side effect to the medication, they just have to treat the diabetes like it was a separate illness, which basically it is, even though it's been caused by the medication. So under certain conditions, steroids, I forgot to mention steroids, which are used to treat anything from arthritis to bone problems, that can also cause it. So you have a group of medications that can cause diabetes, or it can be genetic, or it can be caused by a virus, or it can be caused because of insulin resistance, in which you have enough insulin, but the insulin is not of high quality, or somehow the cells can't use it efficiently. Any of those things can cause diabetes. But the thing that I want to point out is you don't have to feel guilty about any of that. If you can find out what caused it, then that's, I think, a good thing to know. Knowledge is power. And you need to know it, because what if you have children, or what if your children marry people who are diabetic? What happens to them? You know, having knowledge about what you are and what you have and how did you get it, it's not necessarily going to heal it. But what it can do is it can help you to put a handle on it. You know what you're dealing with. You know why you have it. And you know how it happened. And you know what the symptoms are. You feel like you have more control if you know what it is, if you understand it. I mean, I'd hate to be a diabetic and have gone through almost 30 years of diabetes and not have a clue as to what's happening in my body or why. Now, I would hate that. I need to know, but I need to know, not just to teach, I need to know because it helps me to know what I can do and what I can expect and what happens next and things like that. And that kind of information comes from knowledge, and there's no getting around it. You need the knowledge. So when you first get diagnosed with the diabetes, how are you going to feel? Well, first of all, you're probably going to feel grief and anger and feel disillusioned and feel confused and upset and all kinds of range of emotions that you have like you have when you have a grief process. Well, how come? What are you grieving? You are grieving the loss of yourself. You're grieving the loss of your healthy self, because now you're not free just to get up and go on your way. You don't just jump out of bed, take a shower, throw on some clothes and have a breakfast and then you're off for the day. No, you've got to take your shot. You've got to check your blood sugar, see what it is. You've got to chart it. You've got to take your medication. You have to have enough protein. You have to have enough carbs. Everything has to be in balance, so you check your blood sugar. And you do all the things you have to do, medications, sometimes shots, and you make sure you've got the right kind of breakfast. Do you have enough protein? Do you have enough carbohydrates and all of that? And then you have to leave. And when you have to leave, when you go out for the day, you have to have your insulin with you. You have to have your glucose meters with you so you can test it. You have to carry snacks just in case you crash and you have a low and you have to get it up quickly, which is why I always bring a soda with me, because that takes care of that. And all of that you have to do. And then if it's hot, you have to make sure your insulin is iced, which means you have to use a little cooler or put a little bag that can carry ice in your purse so you can take it with you. I mean, it is just really, really inconvenient. But if you don't do all of those things that you're supposed to do, you will get complications. And the goal that you should have once you've been diagnosed with diabetes is not to get into complications, because complications can really disable you for life. You can go blind, you can have an amputation, but it doesn't mean it's going to have to happen. What I want to help you with is not to have a false guilt. It's not your fault. You didn't have it because you asked for it. You didn't have it because you did anything wrong. You have it because that's just the product of nature. It's either in your genes or something happened to you, but you were not in charge of that. So you have to realize that getting angry with yourself or getting angry with the doctors that diagnosed you, or denial is a big thing. I can remember saying to people, well, I'm a little diabetic, until one of my doctors says, there's no such thing as being a little diabetic. You either are or you aren't. And if you are, then you've got it. You know the statement, you can't be a little bit pregnant. You either are pregnant or you're not pregnant. You know, at 1 month, your baby is less than an inch in length, but that doesn't mean you're any less pregnant. So you're starting a diabetic journey, and you need help in getting through it. And after a while, it becomes more commonplace. And then when it becomes more commonplace, then you can react with it. Now it's just a matter of fact. I get up, I take my blood sugar. Or if I'm going to head for the shower, I take the blood sugar before I go into the shower. Or if I'm going on a long drive, I take the blood sugar before I drive. Because it is possible to get into an accident because you didn't know that your blood sugar was too low, and you need to have something to eat, and by the time you get symptoms, it's kind of late, but you can still drive. There's no reason why you can't. Now, if you're a brittle diabetic, as I am, it poses a problem if you're being constantly up and down and up and down, too high, too low, too high, too low, and sometimes there's no rhyme or reason. You know, my doctor called me and said, couldn't you figure out why you're so low in the first half of the month and so high on the second half of the month? This was just very recent. And they left me a message about it, and I called them back, and I said, honestly, I don't have a clue. I'm not doing anything different. Sometimes it's high, sometimes it's low. But you have to constantly monitor that, because you're either going to have insulin that you have to take, or you're going to have to take sweets to build up to make sure that your blood sugar is high enough. So it is kind of a problem. So you grieve, and sometimes you feel guilty, and you don't need to do that. The grief is normal and natural, because your body is changing and will continue to change, because diabetes is a progressive illness, and it will progress throughout the rest of your life. You will always have it. That's one of the problems with having a chronic illness. Whatever the chronic illness is, I mean, a lot of the things I'm saying about diabetes can be applied to other chronic illnesses. It's a chronic illness will not leave you. You will always have it. Barring some miracle of God, you will always be a diabetic, or whatever chronic illness that you have. It's not going to leave. And it's progressive in the sense that it gets worse with age. The complications and the difficulties that you have with it will get worse with age. It'll get, as someone said, one of my friends said to me, he was a pastor, and he says, you know, be careful, Pat. I'd been just diagnosed. He says, this is a creeping disease. It creeps up. It gets worse and worse and worse. You can manage it. That's the best you can do, is just to manage it. You can't, through your own efforts, heal it. It just doesn't work that way. So you've been diagnosed, and what I'm going to do, I think I'm going to close here, and I'm going to spend one more segment on this, because we're getting very close to the end of the half hour. So I'll close it here, and whatever I say in the next segment will be the final segment on diabetes, and then the following segment after that will start something else. So I will have one more segment on diabetes, and so why don't you join me next time, and we'll complete this process together.